So, is it okay that I make a video? Do I have your consent to be in the video and
She
everything?
has my consent.
Perfect.
Hello, TV land. So,
I don't know if you wanted to introduce yourself or.
sure. I'm Professor Michael Anthony Novak. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, Theology, and Religion at St. Leo University.
Alright. So my video presentation, as I mentioned before, is about the problem of evil.
Mm,
So I just have a few questions to ask you about that.
sure.
In your own words, what is the problem of evil and how would you describe
The problem of evil is considered the biggest philosophical problem with belief in an all good, all powerful God. And in short, uh, pretty with belief in classical theism, classical belief in God. In short, the problem goes this way: if there is an all good, all powerful God, how could there be evil? Um, if God were all powerful, God would not allow evil to happen. If God were all good, uh, God would not have created a world in which evil was possible. Uh, you see this problem pop up everywhere from ancient philosophy to last year's movie, Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice, where Lex Luthor gives a speech like this against Superman, who he somehow equates with God, uh, but uh, uh, but stating those two problems, or stating those two ends of the problem right there. If God is all good, God can't be all powerful. If there's evil, if God is all powerful, then He can't be good, for because evil exists. So it is an old question. Many people seem to think it's a very modern, new, deeply penetrating question, but it is a question people have been throwing around um, since antiquity and reflecting on for a long time.
it? It's interesting because I never really thought about it until I started taking these classes.
Hmm.
I mean, I knew there was evil, but I just didn't really question it, you know?
Right, right, right.
So,
Okay.
so for the next question, do you think that some types of evils are worse than others? For example, is moral evil worse than natural evil?
Hmm. Okay, so that's a distinction you've used in class. I know I used it in my class, but moral and natural evil.
Mhm.
Yeah, natural evil doesn't seem like a problem at all to me. Natural evil uh, is simply the fact that the universe can have sharp edges. Um, and now I see that was just off of camera screen, but I was tapping the pointed edge of my desk right here. Um, the fact that I have a squared desk like this just makes it handy for holding papers, so forth. But I do know that that corner of my desk right here could kill me if I tripped in the right way over there as I'm coming in the door and my head fell in such a way that it impacted with this at just the right angle at the right speed. That could kill me, which is not to say that this is an evil desk. Um, it is simply the nature of matter and choices we use to make with things. A hurricane or a tornado destroying my home, a shark eating me, me getting skin cancer from the sun. These are things which will all personally inconvenience me and really suck at different levels. Um, but it's a different thing than moral evil when you simply leap out of your chair and begin to strangle me to death. Uh, that is much more egregious. The other one is are consequences of just the way nature works. Um, I don't know that that's the case with what we call moral evil. Uh, Someone could make the argument, I suppose, that too is just the way things work. That people have evil in them, but uh, but we seem to have this sense that evil is a flaw. Evil is an aberration. It's offensive. It should not be there. We hold people accountable for it. You shouldn't go around strangling your professors, and we will put you in jail if you do. Um, so in that sense, I would say definitely for me, the notion of moral evil is the real evil that we're talking about here. Um, I don't see a problem with the idea of an all good creator God, uh, that even if there was no evil, Adam and Eve in the garden, Adam still shouldn't walk off a cliff. That's going to have bad consequences, um, just the way gravity and rocks work together.
Okay, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So for my next question, we talked about the book of Job in class. So I wanted to bring it up here. Does the book of Job accurately describe why God allows suffering to happen? Why or why not?
No, I don't think it does. But in a sense, I don't think it offers an explanation. This is, in a sense, the frustrating thing with Job as a piece of literature that is also maybe a piece of philosophy or theology. It doesn't really try to answer that question. Uh, the character of God in the poem, at the end of the poem, uh, basically says to Job, when Job asks these questions, where were you when I made the universe? Why do you even think you can understand this complexity? Um, and and that may be an answer in the sense of like maybe we're not old enough as a race, complex enough as thinkers to understand the problem. Of course, as a philosopher and theologian, I don't like that answer because I want to figure stuff out. But I also recognize in Catholicism, I mean, we see the Book of Job as sacred scripture, but we also see it as a human production. It is a work of art that has scriptural value in it, but not scripture in the sense of this is the final answer book that God emailed to us one day. Um, in a sense, maybe the answer of the Book of Job is uh, that it's tough to understand these things. That's true as far as it goes. It's not a personally satisfying ends the question for me answer. Um, but I do think it tells us that if we want to try to work towards some answers, we're going to be putting in quite a bit of work for it. Let's say maybe that what Job says is there are no easy answers, and I think that might be more fair. But Job is not the book I would go to for my final investigation of the question. It's a good beginning to the question, perhaps more.
Yeah, I like talking about the book of Job, and I like the story.
Okay.
But it's very confusing, and it's kind of hard to understand when you dig deeper into it.
And I think Job is an unusual book of the Bible in the sense that we actually have different versions of it other than just the one that's included in the Bible. And so what we see evidence of different writers tinkering with it over the years. And I think I said something like this in class. There are stories that we keep retelling and tinkering with. There have been so many books, poems, books, now TV shows and movies about the King Arthur legends. And we keep retaking those old stories and reusing them in different ways, maybe for some of the concerns we have today, or some different emphasis we have for today. But Job, in that sense, always has seemed to be, I think, it's maybe the classically unfinished book. There's more to work on the problem, and so you still see artists today playing with Job in different ways, using Job as a jumping off point for a screenplay that isn't a literal telling of the story of Job, but with some of its references, you can see that that's the text that the screenwriter is in dialogue with, is thinking about. Job raises the question in a fantastically but it's like you can look at a Michelangelo piece and say this says something definitive about the human body that David does. But is it the last word in art about the human body? No way.
Right.
There's more to say, but it's a good starting point.
I agree. All right. Would you consider poverty as a type of evil?
Mostly, uh, there are poverties that are chosen. That's very different. The monk who chooses a life of poverty as a way to push themselves spiritually, um, or as a way of living among those who are poor not by choice. Um, Occasionally, poverty uh, could be not good in itself, but potentially good for someone. Um, so uh, I was with friends this weekend. This family owns a $1 billion company, so very wealthy friends of mine. Um, uh, and the kids in the family have had different stories. Some of them uh, not having their inheritance at hand, there's so much to draw upon, and have had to struggle to support themselves. And then one who has never had to struggle, never had to figure out how to stay alive on $100 for a week or something like that. And where you think like, at least a dose of poverty, the dose of the struggle, the hardship might actually be good for the person who has as the old saying puts it, the silver spoon born in their mouth. So, uh, but there are a lot of ways then those comments aside, there are a lot of ways in which poverty seems to me to be a great evil. So much of it seems to come from the mismanagement of our resources. Our planet produces enough food to feed everybody, but we don't get it to everybody. Um, we have that capacity, but we have yet uh, to fully enact it. We're actually doing a lot better than we were 50 years ago, but there are still people who are hungry on this planet. Um, then there's a sliding scale of poverty that makes that a weird question. I grew up in an impoverished family in the United States. We were below the poverty line, as the federal government defined it. But we had indoor heat and indoor plumbing, a microwave oven, a television set, um, access to the public library, uh, and uh, and 3 meals a day. And that doesn't look very poor compared to some of my peasant ancestors, I'll bet. Um, Even my great grandfather, who couldn't sign his own name. And so, you know, there is that sort of complicated question of what is poor at one time, was that poor in an earlier time, or what is poor in one culture looks pretty good in a different culture. So poverty is one of those things that has a context to it. I don't know. That at the very least, I don't think gets rid of poverty being an evil. Uh, but how poverty is an evil is a complicated question. It depends upon context. It depends upon choices. The person who's poor because they would because they're so rude or something that they can't hold a job, they keep getting fired or something like that. Is that poverty a consequence of other things? Um, I guess this is the case with all moral questions. There are very simple, basic, easy answers one can give. Poverty is an evil. Done. But to say how poverty is an evil becomes almost a case by case kind of issue. You have to look at the context in each individual case.
Yeah, it's a lot more broad than what I was like when I originally wrote these. I didn't realize how much you have to consider
Sure.
when answering the question. So,
Well, I think it's like in people who are doing something like a social work major here. We come up with programs for fighting poverty, and sometimes the programs help, and other times the programs have unintended consequences where they can help perpetuate poverty in a different way, and or they work for some people, but they don't work, they don't help for other people, and why is that? So I think it's something that in a Christian university, as Christians in society, is something that is absolutely necessary for us to deal with. But it is a complicated and wily beast, and I don't think it's going to be easy to slay that dragon. So, yeah.
all right, that is all I have for
That's it.
you.
I thought maybe you were going to go one place. Why did you pick the specifically poverty question as a specific example of an evil, or?
I picked it because I know we talked about it in our class.
Right.
And I don't know, I just find it interesting because I know it's such a huge problem. And I know that not one thing is just going to solve it.
Sure.
There's a lot of different things that have to go into helping alleviate it.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
What are you thinking about? What are you studying? Have you figured it out?
I'm a middle grades education
Okay.
major.
Okay.
So.
Good. So I taught high school before I went back for my PhD, but middle school, you're starting to introduce kids to the complexity of the world a little bit more. They'll get more of that in high school for sure, but there's less hand holding than at the grade levels. I'm just going to read to you right now. You're just trying to make sure they figure out their letters and their numbers. But you might start doing something like history classes, social studies classes, and you're going to run into why is the world kind of crummy in some places.
Yeah,
So,
I actually am specializing in social studies. So.
Oh, okay, excellent. Okay, yeah, well then this makes perfect sense to me because you're going to have to face questions like this and figure out how to best introduce students to them. And I think that's, to me, I started with sophomores in high school, and even taking one grade down to freshmen, I found too difficult. Freshmen were too much of a different beast. I would never want to go down to junior high because that's just a technical skill to translate at sort of each grade level, each age level. Certainly remember starting to wake up at that age myself and ask these tougher kinds of questions. So it's interesting then to see how asking questions like this or you paying attention to them could be those kinds of topics that you may have to address at some point.
Definitely.
Yeah, fun.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure, glad to help out.